Welcome to Via the Grapevine, offering you the chance to learn more about wine, the masters behind them, and even which wines to collect. Award-winning British journalist and master of wine, Tim Atkin, has released his 9th annual guide to South African wines, his 2021 special report. And he joins me now. Welcome, Tim. It's lovely to see you.
Guy, lovely to see you. I'm particularly enjoying the portrait of Nelson behind you and the bottle of Secateurs. You've got a fantastic backdrop.
Thank you. I'm glad you noticed. I did it specifically for you. I thought
Ardi was sponsoring the event.
Well, given the amount of high-scoring Swartland wines, it was only appropriate that this interview should be accompanied by a Swartland wine.
And Secateurs is great value. It's one of my, I mean, the rosé was my value rosé of the year. Excellent wine, lovely wine.
Yeah, indeed.
All good. Yeah.
Last time we spoke was telephonically in 2018 when you just announced your very first 100-point scoring New World wine. Mm-hmm. And I remember there being, here in South Africa, you maybe weren't too party to it, but there was a lot of debate and some shock and around how you could score this wine so highly and what was, and the debate around the scoring, and SA wine gurus were taking each other to task over their scoring templates. It was absolutely wonderful. You ruffled feathers.
I think maybe that's part of the point, isn't it?
Exactly. But I think the youth of today have got a saying that encapsulates that sort of thing, or these sort of occurrences perfectly. They say, let's normalize. Let's normalize a winning culture in wine. Yeah. And I think that's kind of what your scores in your recent report are saying, aren't they? There's a lot of winning that's happening. The levels have increased.
Definitely true. I mean, you know, just on that one wine to start with, it's been gratifying for me to see its success really in the auction rooms and in the marketplace. I mean, not as a reflection of my score. I mean, partly that's true, I suppose, but just for brand South Africa and saying, hey, South Africa does have a top tier that's worth investing in if you want to do that kind of thing, that's worth laying down, that's worth cellaring, that's worth collecting, you know. So that's all that did really. I mean, it's funny the South African reaction to it, because in many ways I think South Africans are very proud of being South African. You know, I certainly got that sense when I was communicating with people on Twitter during the Lions series. You know, there was a lot of going backwards and forwards. People are very proud to be South African, and rightly so. But you know, it's amazing. In Argentina, it took a lot longer for me to give a 100-point score. In Argentina, I gave 1 this year for the first time, and every time I went over there, I've never given 1 in Chile. So that Argentinian journalists have said to me, what's wrong with us? Why won't you give us 100 points? Whereas, and they say, Luis Gutierrez has given us 10, James Suckling has given us 15. What's wrong with that? You know, what's wrong with you? Whereas in South Africa, it's the opposite. I gave 1, I've now given 4, and people are complaining. Or I'm hoping that's kind of going to stop. Who knows? I mean, you know, there are always people who want to give you a kicking, and that's fair enough, really. That's part of being a journalist and having an opinion. But I very much hope that people will accept that these wines are world class. You know, even if you take the numbers out of it, just look at what they taste like. You know, are they good enough to compete with the great wines of the world? And I think they are.
Well, before we continue, let's sell your report quickly.
Thank you.
It's available on your website for 20 quid. Yeah. Tim, who should purchase the report? Is it purely for wineries and wine commentators, or will novice wine drinkers enjoy it as well?
I mean, I think there's something for everybody. I mean, you know, at the most basic level, it will just tell you which wines to buy, not only expensive wines, because in the back of the report, I list all of the scores and all of the wines that I've reviewed with their price points. So if, for example, you look up a wine that's got 90 points and it sells for 55 Rand, as one of my top scoring, or my value for money Chardonnay this year, white wine, you can buy that. It is pretty detailed, you know, so you can take as much of it or as little out of it as you want. That's at the most basic level. It was just a buying guide. At the top level, I mean, the introduction is about 9,000 words, and it's a pretty extensive overview of what's happening in South Africa at the moment in terms of, you know, what's planted, how many hectares there are, what's happening in the industry. So, you can take out of it what you want, really. But I mean, if for somebody who's a wine professional or a pretty serious wine lover, there's a lot of meat in there. For somebody just a casual drinker, there's easily enough, he says, hoping they'll buy it, for you to get a recommendation about which Sauvignon Blanc is best at 100 Rand.
Brilliant. Well, there you have it then. It's really a report for everybody. And
well, I would say that, wouldn't I?
Of course you would. But I mean, especially if you're trying to learn more about wine, these are the kind of complements to your learning that you need to invest in. So £20 is not a lot in pounds. It's 391 rand and some change in South African rands. And even that is less than a bottle of a fine wine, so very affordable. And again, last night you announced live on Instagram, which, by the way, you did phenomenally well. I was hugely impressed with your media skills, and a lot better than I managed to do previous to this chat.
No, I think you're conducting this chat brilliantly. I mean, we just had a problem with the technology, but technology, you can't predict technology. It's just all over the place.
It is. But yeah, so you announced that 100-point scoring wine. It's the fourth one since the inception of the South African guide. And it's a second 100-pointer for Ibn Sadi from you. He scored 100 for his Rhone style, 2019 Sadi family Columella. What was it, Tim, about this wine that elevated it from the 99 points territory of the other three wines to its place of glory? I mean,
I should say to start with that scoring is subjective, right? We all know that, and it may be stupid, you know, or may sound stupid to some of the people watching this, thinking, how can you tell the difference between a 99 and 100? Well, I mean, you know, we're nitpicking. I suppose the difference is I just thought that emotionally this wine connected with me. It's not just a great wine, which I think it is very much, but it's a wine that moves me. And I suppose, you know, that's very subjective, isn't it? What moves me might not move you, you know, whether it's a piece of music or a piece of art or a wine. But I just thought, this is sublime. You know, I think that when you taste something like that, and I tasted it several times over a period of a few weeks because I used a Coravin, so I was kind of retasting it. And I just thought, this is one of the greatest wines I've ever tasted, you know, and it's a young wine. Coincidentally, it was in its 20th vintage. And I think it's also a wine with a bit of a track record. I mean, the first one was in 2000, and Ibn in those days was not known at all. He was still the winemaker at Spice Route, and made this wine. And even then you could tell that there was something special about him. I mean, you know, I think that he's now recognized rightly, I think, as one of the great winemakers of the world, not just by me, but, you know, a couple of years ago, the Institute of Masters of Wine have something called the Winemaker's Winemaker. And a lot of top winemakers and indeed winemaking MWs vote for the person they think is the best winemaker. And Ibn won it, you know, so he's up there with the Angelo Gaias and the Peter Gagos and, you know, the top, and the Anne-Claude Leflèvres, although she's no longer with us, the top winemakers of the world. So, I mean, partly Ibn, but just mainly, I just thought the wine was sublime. And I gave 3 99s, 2 whites from the same property, which is Barcy van Lille's vineyard on Citrusdal Mountain. And the other one was Porceleinberg, which had 100 last year for the 18 vintage, and the 19 vintage this year was pretty close, actually. I mean, you know, I mean, I nearly gave 200s, but then, you know, honestly, you can't believe the shit you get. It's like,
I can imagine.
It's all about score inflation, and people who, you know, have competitions of their own to promote will always have a pop at you because they're not happy about it. But anyway, I think best ignored.
It's very interesting, as you say. It's very subjective and finite, and I think I get what you mean from a point of just feeling it. So often there'll be a wine that you'll stick your nose into and you just go, oh, yes, that's heaven.
Yeah.
And that's already scoring points in your mind. And then you start looking at the structure and all the rest of it. So I get that. What do you think has changed in South Africa such that, as you said last night, that you now believe Syrah is our best red wine? I found that fascinating.
I do. I mean, I think the reason I said that is it's not to downplay the quality of a lot of Cabernet and Cabernet-based blends, or indeed Cabernet Franc or Pinot Noir or
Pinotage
Cinsault or Pinotage or things like that. But I just think great Syrahs are made in a greater range of places in South Africa, a greater range of terroir, if you like, or sub-regions, and express those places very clearly in the glass. It's almost like there's less baggage with Syrah, because Syrah, I mean, you know, it's an old grape variety in some senses. In South Africa, probably came in the second half of the 19th century. But there's not the baggage that there is around Cabernet and Bordeaux style blends. I think that, you know, South Africa has always measured itself in the world against Bordeaux at the top end for its red wines. It said, you know, our red wines are as good as Bordeaux, they age as well, blah, 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 blah. But I think it's sort of not done that with Syrah in quite the same way. It's not said, hey, we're as good as Chave, or, you know, we're as good as Clap or whatever. And I always think there are fewer places that do Syrah really well in the world. I mean, lots of places make good Cabernet. I mean, Cabernet is the most planted grape variety in the world, red grape variety, for a good reason, is that it's, you know, it expresses, you know, it does well in a wide variety of countries. In South Africa, funnily enough, I think that Cabernet, if we're going to talk about Cabernet and the Bordeaux styles, tends to be a Stellenbosch phenomenon. I mean, you know, there are a few good examples on Simonsberg Paarl. You know, there's obviously Craig Wessels' wine from Restless River in the Upper Hemelonada Valley. There are a few good Cabernets made outside, but it tends to be a Stellenbosch phenomenon, a little bit of Paarl maybe. Whereas Syrah is, you know, it's made in so many different places, you know, from Agulhas to Ceres. You know, it's you can find these amazing Syrahs, but one spot in particular, well, two really, I would say. One is in the Swartland, and you've got those two styles, the kind of Paardeberg style and the Riebeck Castile style, so granite against schist. But the other place that's amazing, I think, is the Polkadry Hills, that little kind of area that includes Reinecker, that includes Boschkloof, and that includes Lucas van Logrenberg's wine, Graft. I think those three wines are just outstanding.
So from listening to you, there's obviously a lot to be said then for what has appeared to have been a new marketing strategy, and nothing wrong with it, here in South Africa, where a lot of winemakers are starting to talk about a sense of place, and obviously that's to define a regionality. But there's obviously, it's working, because now you're noticing the Syrahs in context of that.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think in South Africa, you almost have three tiers or sections, if you like, to the wine market. There's one bit of it which is mostly cheap and pretty cheerful. You know, I think cheap, inexpensive South African wine is as good as anybody's, really, you know, particularly if it's made from things like Chenin. And those wines very often have no sense of place, and why should they? You know, if they're kind of, you know, 40 to 100 rand bottles of wine, you know, in the UK that would probably be 499 to 899 pounds. You know, you don't really want a sense, or indeed expect a sense of place. Then once you get up into the middle and upper tiers, you've got wines like Columella, which are not from a single vineyard, which are pan-regional expressions, you know, within the same region, or even across a number of regions. There are a number of examples of that. You know, Keat First Verse would be another example of that, where he's blending stuff across Stellenbosch. And then at another level, and it's the level that I really appreciate, it's the one you're talking about, it's the site-specific wines. And I think that the Old Vine Project has helped to promote that. I mean, although a lot of the best Old Vine Project wines are whites, not reds, there are a few exceptions. And I think people are starting to make this link between grape varieties and or styles and sub-regions and vineyards, and within those even, you know, specific vineyard plots. And I think that's very exciting, and it's a major development for South Africa that's happened really in the last 15 years, I would say. I mean, Eben Sadi started doing his Old Vine series, I don't know, probably 20 years ago, maybe say 20 years. You know, I think obviously there were wines from specific vineyards in the past. I'm not denigrating what happened before, but I think that movement is very much a post-94 movement. And indeed, I would say it's even a post kind of 2000 movement. I think it's the last 20 years we've seen that, with the young guns coming in and buying grapes from really good growers.
I hear that there's a worldwide, or some say there's a worldwide move to lighter reds. Is that true? Is that your experience? Well,
it's difficult to say, isn't it? Because I think different markets and different countries have different palates, and within those countries, different people have different palates. And I think if you look at you know, generalizing grossly, look at the Chinese market is still quite an undeveloped market, and in undeveloped markets people tend to go for recognized brands. They tend to go with red wines for oak and power, and something substantial. I think that's still true of some markets in the States, not so much on the coasts and maybe, Chicago, Illinois, those areas. But I think in the center of the States, the Texas market, for example, still tends to be focused on those kind of big styles of wines. I mean, for shorthand, we call them Parkerized wines. I think it's a bit unfair on him because he didn't only like those style of wines, but they were typified as a Parker style. But there are others, I think America, a lot of Americans still like those bigger styles. But as you said, I think worldwide, the kind of wines that I like, and I think the critics whose opinions I respect, Luis Gutierrez, who writes about South America, as I do, and about Spain, Neil Martin, who's another critic, a British critic who writes about South Africa too. I think we tend to like fairly similar styles, and they tend to be more elegant, food friendly, in inverted commas, focused on minerality, this slightly stupid word, but which means a stoniness, a freshness, where oak is not the dominant player, fruit quality. And I think those wines, very often, they're wines that don't sort of bludgeon you into submission. They kind of seduce you in a way. They're gentler on the palate, they're gentler on the nose, and I think they age well. I think the misconception in the past was that those kinds of wines didn't age. And I think that's bollocks, if you'll forgive my French. I think that
I agree, and I think they add a dimension to wine tasting that perhaps didn't exist 40 years ago, when it was just the very big, firm, bold wines. Here, you're giving the people an opportunity to work their palates slowly towards the bigger and bolder or more tannic wine. So
and there's
nothing wrong with starting off light, really.
And there's also nothing wrong with those styles. I love Chateauneuf du Pape, 15.5% alcohol sometimes. I mean, that's fine. I like Bordeaux. I mean, I definitely like young Bordeaux, but I'm very happy to drink tannic Bordeaux or Port or Barolo, which is tannic. I don't think it's wrong to divide the world into 2 camps or 3 camps. The whole thing is a continuum, and that means that there are points along the continuum where we can all find our place or places. And also, what you're drinking Secateurs now, you might be drinking Skurfberg tonight, or same thing. I drank Columella last night. I might be drinking Pinot Noir tonight, or nothing. I will be drinking something, but
hopefully hot chocolate. Because it's autumn there now. You'll have to go.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. On that continuum, one of the varieties that I'm so intrigued to see coming to the fore, and it's one that you've certainly given massive accolades to in your latest report, is of course Chenin Blanc. And just from a personal note, my journey in wine kind of started with Chenin Blanc, with a conversation with somebody who was promoting wine, and I kind of flatly turned down Chenin Blanc back then and said, I've never tasted one that didn't smell like cat pee. And she said, oh, really? Well, let me introduce you. And the first Chenin she introduced me to was Ken Forrester, which I realized then I needed to keep the act going. So when she said, so now do you believe me that there's a lot to be said for Chenin? I said, yeah, kind of. I mean, I'm getting there slowly but surely. But yeah, in terms of where it's come from, you've got the 2020 Skurfberg Chenin Blanc and the Alhate Vineyards Magnetic North, both taking 99 points each, both the product of an old vine. I was just thinking, do you sense a need for a new category in your next report, a best old vine category, perhaps?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I suppose the thing to remember is that the old vine category is quite small, and it's probably about 3,500 hectares, I think, out of what you've got 92,000 hectares now in the country, more or less. So it's quite small. I'd say the other thing, the danger with basing a marketing strategy on old vines is that 35 years old, which is the cutoff point in South Africa, well, although there are much older vineyards, obviously, would be pretty young in parts of Spain, for example. I mean, Spain, you're falling over 100-year-old vineyards in parts of Spain. So yes, I think it's been very important, the old vine movement, if you like, and I think South Africa's really led the world in promoting old vines and getting people talking about it and saving old vineyards, and all that's very important. But I think that's not a bad question. Should I do an old vine, best old vine, white or red? I'll think about it. Watch this space, and I'll give you a shout out on when I do the Instagram live. I say this is Guy's idea. He told me to do this, and I say okay, fine.
And then Andre Morgenthal will invite me out.
Yeah, exactly. Then Andre Morgenthal might send you a nice bottle of wine.
Oh, yeah, or a case. I wanted to ask another question because our time is limited, so I'm going to kind of rush through. But have you seen a decline in global wine production since COVID? Is the pandemic hitting other countries as hard as it hit us here in South Africa?
Well, I mean, yes and no. I think that, Europe has had a very difficult vintage this year, not so much because of COVID as because of frost. This is going to be the smallest vintage, and certainly in the last 10 years in France, possibly of my wine writing lifetime. So there's going to give me a big shortage of wine in certain regions in France. Whether COVID has actually reduced production and whether people are giving up because of COVID, I'm not sure. I think it's too early to say. A little bit like in South Africa, what's the impact of COVID going to be on the industry? Well, you can look at restaurant closures. So far, there have been a few takeovers and a little bit of consolidation, but the wineries seem to have hung on. I think some grape growers are getting out of wine and going into other things like, citrus and so-called easy peelers and tea and things like that, because the yields are better and the money's better, and don't blame them. But I mean, they're pretty tenacious South African wine professionals. I kind of think that they'll hang on. So, I mean, we're still in COVID in many ways. I mean, I hope it doesn't happen, but you may get a fourth wave later this year. I think we'll know more when we finally come out the other side.
Yeah, it's been very dramatic times. Rosé, also featured as we mentioned at the beginning of the interview, seems to be quite literally finding a place in the sun. And I read somewhere that Prosecco Rosé will be the next big thing. Is that right?
It depends who for. I mean, possibly not for me, but I think, Prosecco sales definitely in the UK have gone bonkers. I mean, Prosecco is, it's the sparkling wine of choice for many people, partly because it's affordable and it's slightly sweet. So it's sort of posh person's Moscato, or so, I don't know, but not quite. But I think Prosecco is a really good drink. Is it something that I enjoy drinking on a day-to-day basis? I don't really. It's not really my kind of style. But I think the rosé category is really exciting, and particularly the dry rosé category, both still and lightly and sparkling. But I think the dry still rosé category is really interesting, and there are quite a few good examples in South Africa. I think people are taking it more and more seriously, and not just regarding it as a place to put their worst grapes. Or the grapes that couldn't ripen, or just getting rid of the stuff. Or a saignée, a bleeding off from a vat of red fermenting grapes. I think they're actually sometimes looking at specific blocks that are well suited to producing rosé. Good news. Yeah, very good news.
I'd like to touch quickly on you personally and ask if you don't mind giving us some insight, because I'm fascinated by this.
Yeah.
Your daily tasting regime, what does that look like? Because you tasted 1,783 wines to compile our report.
Yeah.
It's not the only report you're doing. Yeah. So just take us through an average day in Tim Atkins's life.
Well, do you know what? There's no such thing. It tends to, usually it's divided into three chunks, really. It's being on the road. And until COVID, I was probably doing that 4 to 5 months of the year, maybe 4 months of the year. It's tasting at home, and I've always got lots of samples that are sent to me, and I'm sitting here in my office and my tasting bench over there, and I'm doing that. And it's writing, and it's the writing bit that I like all three bits of it. But it's funny when people say, "Oh, I'd love your job. You just get up and you taste wine, you drink wine all day." Yes, you do, but you've got to take tasting notes. But then you've got to write about them, and so there are fairly furious bits of writing. So there was a month really of tasting, first of all, for the report, and I did that month of tasting. And I was tasting about 180 wines a day, and my limit tends to be sort of 100 or so, I'd say. I don't usually, when I'm traveling, taste much more than that, because I think that's a lot. Then when I was writing, I was doing 8-hour days writing the thing up, really. And, it's like a prison sentence where I actually have a little form that I fill in, and I do 25 every 2 hours. And I do 75 during a day, and then I have breaks just to keep me fresh. I mean, it doesn't, it's not coal mining, is it? Or working in a,
it's hard work.
A slaughterhouse, but it's quite physically or mentally demanding, and you've got to be precise, and also you've got to find you know, different ways of describing the same, you know, same varieties, you know, over and over again, really.
And you're having to draw on ethereal elements. It's your sense of smell, your sense of taste, your creativity in terms of what you write. There's nothing definitive, you know. Down the coal mine, there's a block. Give it a go.
Go and do it.
You know,
yeah,
it's easy work, really.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's easy work. You know, and I'm acutely aware that it's a very nice way to earn a living. You know, I mean, usually traveling, but also tasting wine. I mean, you know, people do very hard jobs and earn a living in tough ways. And I'm lucky enough to do something that I really enjoy. It's fun, you know.
Without digging too deep into your report, what are some of the other varietals that you've tasted in South Africa that you recommend we invest in?
Well, I mean, I don't know what you mean by, do you mean invest for financially or
for appreciation later?
For appreciation.
Because, maybe they're showing well now, and maybe one or two financial.
I mean, I think on the white wine side, apart from Chenin, I would say white blends, both so-called Mediterranean blends, which include Chenin, and then Bordeaux white blends, which is obviously Bordeaux varieties, Sauvignon, Chardonnay. Those would be, I mean, Chardonnay is really good. And I think Semillon, particularly old vine Semillon, I think is underappreciated and undervalued. On the red side, Cinsault, you know, people tend to think of Cinsault as sort of, you know, raspberries and candy floss, but at its best, again, from specific places, it can be really special. I think it's got really a real sense of place. Grenache, I think Grenache is a coming grape variety, particularly Grenache from Piqueniers-Clouf. And last but not least, Pinot Noir. I mean, I think there was something like 14 Pinot Noirs in my report that were in the wines of the year, 161 best wines of the year. 14 wines from South Africa. Who would have imagined that 20 years ago, you know, when Hemel and Ardagh was just getting going, you know, and had anybody really heard of Elgin as a Pinot Noir area? Just beginning. Series, you know, there are, I mean, the places where Pinot Noir, they're not particularly diverse. They tend to be quite small pockets of South Africa, but I think they've got real potential.
And now, just when we think we're on top of things, the Agulhas Wine Triangle has fired up. Yep. And there's a whole nother little region there and they're pushing the limits and doing
lots of potential. I mean, I don't think we're seeing many great Pinot Noirs from there yet, but I think, you know, certainly Syrah from down there, really good. The wines that Trezane is making. And I think that, you know, white wines, particularly Sauvignon and Semillon.
Yeah, there's Sauvignon
Blanc. Brilliant wine from David Nieuwert.
I've got some quick fire questions to wrap up.
All right.
And I'm literally offering you just two options. Okay. You have to choose just one of the two. Okay. First that comes to mind, Chenin Blanc, wooded or unwooded?
Wooded. But I go for lightly wooded. That's not an option, is it?
It's not, no. So what's your final answer, Tim?
Yeah, I'm going to go wooded.
Wooded.
Yeah.
Okay. Sting and the Police or Mike and the Mechanics?
Sting and the Police.
And I threw that question in because yesterday when I posted a picture of Tim on Twitter, I had a comment from a former boss in the music industry who said, "That's not it. That's Sting you've posted there."
And I think I said if only, didn't I? I mean, do you know, I've never met him, although I did go one of the concerts. I've seen him live a few times, but with Paul Simon, I've seen him with the Police years ago when I was a young man. And last year I saw an amazing concert with a guy called Shaggy. Do you know Shaggy? Who's
I do know Shaggy.
Fantastic, right? And that was one of the greatest concerts. It was 2 years ago. It was pre-lockdown, obviously, and it was at the Roundhouse. And that was one of the great concerts. So there were Police songs, there were Sting songs, there were Shaggy songs, and it was just they didn't stop dancing for 2.5 hours. And I think they did about 6 encores. So they were having a good time as well. So he's somebody I'd love to meet, but and he's got a wine estate. But I have asked to interview him, and so far I've only been offered his wife, as it were.
Oh,
but you never know. I'd like to meet her too, but I think I really would like to interview him sometime. I think I'll meet him. I think it'll be fascinating.
And it would be fascinating to watch it in person as well. I'd like to see the two of you together.
Yeah, it'd be fun.
Glassware, stemless or no thanks, I'll sip out of a can?
I'm going to take stemless.
You okay, interesting. Yeah. And then final one, Yorkshire, stick to the pudding, or can we make some fine wine soon?
I think, can we make some fine wine soon? Go for it, Yorkshire.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Let's hear it for Yorkshire.
British Master of Wine, Tim Atkin, who's just released his 2021 South Africa Special Report, available for just over 391 Rand on his website, timatkin.com. Thank you for your time today, sir, and your passion for South Africa.
Thank you for preparing your questions and for being such a fun interview.
Oh, it's a pleasure. We sincerely appreciate you. Take care.
Bye. Okay.
Cheers. Thank you so much, Tim. Bye-bye.
Bye.